Would you take your Bibles and open to the book of Acts, chapter 18? I'll begin reading at verse 18. After staying there for a considerable time, Paul said farewell to the believers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea he had his hair cut, for he was under a vow. When they reached Ephesus, he left them there, but first he himself went into the synagogue and had a discussion with the Jews. When they asked him to stay longer, he declined, but on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills. Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending time there, he departed and went from place to place through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Now there came to Ephesus a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. He was an eloquent man, well versed in the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. And when he wished to cross over to Achaia, the believers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. On his arrival, he greatly helped those who through grace had become believers, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the Scriptures that the Messiah is Jesus. If we could put the map up, Leslie, of the second missionary journey. You know, back when Paul started his second missionary journey, he revisited the churches of Galatia and then started across, and he wanted to go into Asia, but the Lord prevented him, it said. The Holy Spirit prevented him from going. He ended up going to Philippi, and we talked about closed doors and open doors. And I think it's interesting that the fact that God closes a door in your life for now doesn't mean it's closed permanently. At a later time, that door may open. And it does in the case of Ephesus. Ephesus was a major city in Asia. And we see in this chapter that God opened that door for the gospel, for the apostle. Now, in this chapter, it's hard to, there's a very dramatic demarcation of when the first missionary journey ends and when the second one begins. But it's not that clear between the second and third missionary journey. But we have it in this passage we just read. It actually comes between verses 22 and 23, where he had landed in Caesarea. He set sail from Ephesus, landed in Caesarea, where he comes back down and then goes to Jerusalem, and then he goes back up to Antioch, and then takes off across and visits the churches of Galatia. That's the beginning of the third missionary journey. And this third missionary journey takes place, at least it begins to take place here in Asia, in Ephesus. We have a new mission field here in this part of the world, and we also have new laborers. And that's what I want to talk about this morning, the new laborers that God provides for the mission field. Jesus encourages us to ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the fields. The fields are ripe for harvest. Send out laborers. Ask God to send out laborers. And God sent out laborers to help Paul in this missionary journey here in Ephesus. And the first is this couple, Aquila and Priscilla, that we met last week. We saw that Paul met them in Athens, or in Corinth. And now let's talk about this couple. We saw last week that they're a working couple. They're tent makers by trade. They're business people. They have their own business. They're what you might call a small business. today. We hear that term a lot, small business. They're starting a small business. In fact, it may not be as small as we think. It may include more than the two of them, because we see that they really traveled kind of extensively, and it's possible that they had this business and they had an operation in different places. They had an operation in Rome, they had one in Corinth, and they established one in Ephesus, and they have other people doing that work. We don't know, but we know they're working people here. It doesn't tell us much about their education. We know they're Jews, and that they came from Rome. And the reason they ended up in Corinth was because of the edict that Claudius made that ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. That happened in AD 49. And historians, Suetonius particularly, wrote about an incident that took place in Rome where there was kind of an uproar among the Jews in Rome over this person called Chrestus. Well, the theologians today believe that Suetonius, was really talking about Christ there. And really what this was is it was kind of a discussion or dissension going on. To the Romans, it was just among Jews. But of course, we know it was between Jews who had become Christians and Jews who had not become Christians, and the conflict that was going on there. That was the uproar. That was the issue. But to the Romans, they didn't understand the intricacies of that conflict. To them, it was just Jews causing problems. And so Claudius just expelled them all from Rome in AD 49. We know that Priscilla and Aquila were active Christian people. They were they were already believers when Paul met them. They were believers back in Rome. In fact, they come to Ephesus in about the spring of AD 52. So it hasn't been that long since they left Rome. We know from this passage this morning that they were willing to relocate for the sake of the infant church. I think that's commendable of this couple. And maybe they saw it as a win-win. They can be a part of expanding the gospel and also a part of expanding their business. We don't know, but they were willing to relocate. And I think about the church in Centerville, Lauren and Carrie Pankratz. Lauren came. They were living in Fresno, California, part of a church there, and God had called him. He's a graduate of Princeton Seminary, and God had called him to reach LDS people. He wanted to come to Utah. And the interesting thing is about Lauren and Carrie, they had some friends back in Fresno, part of their church. Some of them were just out of college. Some were still in college. I think one was a young married couple. The others were single. But there were a handful of people that were so committed to what Lauren and Carrie were doing that they decided they would move with him to Centerville. The college students would go to school in Utah, go to the University of Utah. And I was impressed by that commitment of them to be able to decide to just move for the sake of starting a new church. And that's what you see here with Aquila and Priscilla. They were willing to relocate for the sake of this infant church. We know that Paul lived with them while they were in Corinth. And Paul writes, when he wrote his letter to the Romans later from Corinth, actually, on his third missionary journey, when he wrote the letter to the Romans from Corinth, he tells the Romans that Priscilla and Aquila risked their lives for him. Now, we don't have an account of that in the book of Acts, of how that actually happened, but apparently it did. They put their lives on the line for the gospel, for Paul's ministry there. We also know that Priscilla and Aquila had a church in their house. Not only did they have a church in their house in Corinth, but they had a church in their house later when they went back to Rome, and they had a church in their house when they were in Ephesus. I mean, you get the picture here that this is a couple that's committed to the progress of the gospel. We know this because when Paul writes letters, when he wrote 1 Corinthians, he wrote it from Ephesus, and he says to the Corinthians, he says, Priscilla and Aquila greet you, and the church that meets in their house. And that was from Ephesus. And then, of course, in Rome, when he wrote Romans from 1 Corinthians, from Corinth, he said, Priscilla and Aquila send you, or he says, greet Priscilla and Aquila and the church that meets in their house. Well, those are two people that God called up to work with Paul in the work of proclaiming the gospel in Ephesus. And then we come across another man, Apollos. And we read about him in this passage here. We know that Apollos was a Gentile. He was single, apparently. No mention of a spouse here. Sort of an intellectual. He really knew the Scriptures well. He was from Alexandria. Alexandria, Egypt, was one of the great learning centers of the world. And so here was a well-educated man. What we learn from the text here is that he was very learned, in verse 24, that he had a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. Now, when we see that term, the Scriptures, here in the New Testament, we're talking primarily about the Old Testament, because the New Testament was in the process of being written at this time. It certainly wasn't completed, it wasn't near completed. So primarily the Old Testament Scriptures is what we're talking about. In verse 25 says that he was instructed in the way of the Lord. And so that term, at least in the Old Testament, the word Lord is the translation of the Hebrew word Yahweh. He knew the ways of Yahweh. And it says he was a good speaker. He spoke with great fervor, or burning enthusiasm, my translation says. And the word has the idea of a conviction that's based on something that's deeply embedded in his heart. It comes from within. It's not contrived enthusiasm. This is real. He is very fervent and enthusiastic as he preaches. He speaks well, and he's fervent in his preaching. And it says that he taught accurately about Jesus. He does have a liability here. It says he only knew the baptism of John. That is, he knew about what the Messiah was to do from the Old Testament. And we kind of talked about that in Sunday school this morning. Those of you who were there, the Old Testament perspective on the future of the coming Messiah. They were expecting the coming Messiah. And Apollos certainly knew about that, and he concluded rightly, he taught rightly about the nature of the Messiah, what he was to be like. Now, I say that he knew about the Messiah, but he did not know the Messiah in a personal way. I say that because of the way Priscilla and Aquila explained the gospel to him. Here's how it may have happened, because there's an incident in church history of something similar happening. It took place in the middle of the 1500s. A man named Hugh Latimer. Hugh Latimer was a Roman Catholic bishop who knew the Scriptures well. He was well educated. He was an intellectual. He was well taught. And he knew the Scriptures well. But he didn't know Jesus. Later he becomes a Christian. I'll explain how that happened. But later on, Hugh Latimer is well known when he and Nicholas Ridley, another Christian during the early days of the Protestant Reformation, were burned at the stake for their faith. And while they're standing there, tied to the stake, and the fire is being lit, Latimer turns to Ridley and says, "Have faith, Mr. Ridley, and play the man. Because